Yeah, so my name's Clare. I'm coming to you from Switzerland. I'm a scientist in the snow hydrology group at the Swiss Institute of Snow and Avalanche Research. So thanks for having me, and hopefully I don't sound too out of it having had a full day work. So I'm trying to string sentences together in a coherent way. I'll start by sharing my screen. Everyone can see the window?
Yeah, maybe a little bigger on the font if you could. There we go. That's perfect. Okay. Thank you.
So I have the notebook within the hub, but because I kind of want to play around with some interactive figures, and I only saw Scott's tutorial half an hour ago, I have a different way of doing it, which I would change up now if I could. But so I'm just going to run it locally, but you guys can follow on the hub. It's not really a big deal. I just wanted a couple of extra features enabled. So the purpose of my sort of 20 minutes here is to take you through the ASO data sets. So they're SnowDepth data sets. They're collected from LiDAR. They you know, they're a big company and they do lots of campaigns throughout the US. I hope I don't need to cover some concepts of LiDAR. Maybe if people want to give me like a wave or a thumbs up if they want something like that, or if I can just go straight into the data. Okay, given no one wants that, no one's yelling for it, I'm just going to go straight into kind of the data. So, I mean, a LiDAR is basically laser reflections from the Earth's surface. The result is a point cloud, so each point represents one reflection from one component of the Earth's surface. In general, the point clouds are classified and processed using specialized software. The one I'm going to point you in is called PDAL, which is the Python version. There is another one called LAS Tools, which I think Michelle mentioned yesterday. That's what I use, but I would recommend you, if you're starting, you would use PDAL because LAS Tools is built for a Windows environment, and it's also technically licensed. If you run small areas, you don't need a license, but when you want to run large areas, you need a license. So I'm not going to cover point clouds in this tutorial because in the context of SnowEx, ASO already does all the processing of the LiDAR data for us. So I'm just going to focus on the SnowDepth maps as raster data sets. And also I'm going to introduce you a little bit to canopy height models because my background is mainly looking at forest snow interactions and radiative transfer modeling in forests. So, I mean, I'm pretty confident in ASO's data. They sort of claim in exposed areas it's within 1 to 2 centimeters at the 50-meter scale. I don't quite know what that means at the 50-meter scale, but you do run into errors when you have shrubs, where you have geolocation accuracies, geoid problems like Jessica pointed out in the chat, and then when you have forests, you have some issues as well, mainly lower point densities and vegetation under the canopy and things like that. I won't necessarily go into these problems, but we'll be able to see them in the data sets that we're looking at. So there are some general packages needed for the tutorial that I think, you know, everyone took you through these yesterday. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 that you haven't heard of, or that haven't come up. They're not really a big deal, but they should be installed on the hub because I put them there. So if it doesn't work, just shout out. But if we just load the packages and just define a few paths, and just to get to this bit, the reason I'm running it locally is because I want to use this Matplotlib notebook, which allows interactive plots. I think if you're running it on the hub, you'll have to run Matplotlib inline. So I'm not sure which one you have on your, I can't get into the hub because the banner at the top's on my, anyway. So we're going to start. So ASO have 2 different data products. They have a 3-meter product and a 50-meter product. So to start with, we can kind of just open the raster like Scott showed us. And then the first thing to do is check out the CRS, particularly of the ASO data, because ASO data sets are in UTM 13N, and the SnowEx data sets are in 12, or the other way around. I can't actually remember. But so I haven't changed the projections, but because Scott showed you how to do it this morning, I think you should be able, if you're working with the ASO data, that's just something to bear in mind, that it does have a different projection than the SnowEx data. So when you're playing around with the raster, you can pull out like resolution. So obviously it says 3 meters in the data file name, so 3 by 3 meter grid cells. You can also get the boundaries. So to get this file on the hub, I had to clip it to this smaller area, and I don't have the full Grand Mesa area, but the links that you got yesterday to the ASO data and that are at the bottom of this tutorial will take you to the full file. So if you need other areas of Grand Mesa, that's where you can get it. You can also, again, get the dimensions. There's so many different ways. And then again, can plot and show the data. I'm showing it to you like this because you can see along the edges, there are artifacts. So, you know, say white is no snow and blue is really deep snow. So if you're pulling out statistics for snow depth distributions and things like this, just be aware that along the edges of these regions that you do have some funny artifacts. So I would recommend clipping to areas of interest rather than looking at data sets as a whole. So I'm just going to close that and then open it again so we can plot it properly. Okay, so I'm just gonna, did I do this?
Claire, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you mind making your fonts a little bigger? It's a bit small for me. That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I'm looking at it on the big screen, so I
know.
It's a bit difficult. Yeah, so this is an area of the Grand Mesa that I clipped down to. For no particular reason did I choose this area, just to fit it into the 10 megabyte size. So using this interactive, you can sort of zoom in on the areas you're interested in. You can see really nicely in the 3 meter data set, you can see features like roads. You can see where we have less snow depth, and you have these gradients. And obviously this is probably a forest where you have the lower snow depths. And then when you get into the deeper areas, you also have some funny shrubs in this area. Yeah, so you can see these little bumps where there's shrubs. So the 3 meter data set is pretty cool for picking up really fine, oh, I didn't want to do that, really fine scale features. Just reset that. And then you can start pulling out information. Obviously here, I've pulled out the maximum value, excluding the NANs. And the maximum value is 23 meters, somewhere up here. And so this is sort of why I suggest it's really good to clip these areas to where you're interested in, because I don't know much about Grand Mesa. Maybe someone can chime in. Is 23 meters a realistic snow depth in these areas or not? Anyway, so if we really want to start looking at snow depth distributions, we can sort of clip down to an area of interest. The example I'm showing you here is using a canopy height model. So it's a canopy height model that Julia created for her paper in 2019. It's from the 2016 data set. And so the first thing to do is to open the data, and then also, again, just double check that the CRS is correct, which it is. No, this is because I already transformed it, so we wouldn't have to do it as part of the tutorial. But if you do access the data from Julia's NVDAT depository, I think so this has some canopy data from Grand Mesa, if it wants to load. Yeah, so snow depth maps, canopy height maps, terrain elevation, and this is from her look at snow depth distribution relating to forest structure. So to look at the CHM as data, the main thing to think about with canopy height models is the resolution has to be higher, or it's good to have the resolution higher, particularly when you're looking at fine scale snow depth distribution. And the reason for this is, in general, you want to represent individual trees. And as well, if you start to have quite large pixel sizes, you can end up with a maximum canopy height that's misrepresented in lower resolution. So if you just have a mean value, that can pull down that maximum value, so you misconstrue the canopy height. So I've done a 0.5 meter. A meter is also kind of okay for pulling out individual trees, but anything larger than that, and you start to get really clumped canopy height models. If anyone wants to talk about calculating canopy height models or doing anything with canopy height models, I'm more than happy to, but I thought I would just focus more on the actual snow depth data products from ASO here. Again, we can pull out the maximum value here. It's 34 meters. So within this region, we have quite tall trees. And then we can also plot it and have a look. So you can see it's quite a, call it heterogeneous or a gappy area that we're going to look at. And then again, we can zoom in to see that, you know, at 0.5 meter we do have, you can see these individual trees, which is really cool. So if we wanted to clip the raster to the same extent, we can use the dimensions from the canopy height model as a boundary box. And then we just click print. I just want to show you that you have the different coordinates. So the lower left corner, the lower right corner, no, the upper right corner, yeah. The cool thing about this is you can play around with it. You just have to put the minimum and the maximum values in. You can play around with a buffer. So if you wanted an area, but you also wanted to know what was around this as well, you can just add a buffer in. So those are quite efficient ways and quick ways to just clip a canopy height model to an area you have. You can also use shape files, and I've just put a link for a tutorial of how to use a shape file. So if you have a shape file of a boundary of an ISAT2 track or something like this, you can use that example. But so if we just stay with the limits of the canopy height model, just ignore that error. It's just kind of my problem of not updating something. And we just need to get the features so that they can be used within raster.io. And so then we have the coordinates. And then after that, we can just clip the raster. So open the snow depth map and just use it as a mask. I can, if you want more details, I realize it's already 15 minutes in. So if you want more details, I can describe them to you in the chat or elsewhere. And then we also need to copy the meta information to make sure we're copying things like the EPSG code and everything like that. And then we just update that. And then I would suggest saving the TIFF. So if it's something you want to come back to, then you can just save it with writing the TIFF. So I've called it GMB, so Grand Mesa B, and that just matches the name of the canopy height model. And so now we can read the new snow depth back in, and then we can plot it and have a look at it. Now I might just have to drop down the resolution a bit so you can see them next to each other. So this is a snapshot from Google Earth of the area, and this is the 3 meter map. So you can see it picks up the features of the roads really, really nicely, and then you can see these really nice, pretty snow depth patterns. Particularly, you know, you have this shaded edge here, which is the same here, and you have much, much deeper snowpacks on these edges than you do, say, on the south-facing edges. And you can kind of see quite nicely in the aerial image that you have these persistent snowpacks in these shaded locations as well. So that's kind of how cool, how you can use the 3 meter one, but there's also a 50 meter product. And this could be useful if any of you guys are doing any modeling. I know there's a modeling tutorial, I think, tomorrow. And so if you wanted to validate or compare any measured and model data, I think the models run at a coarser resolution than 3 meters, and so this can be a product you can use for that. So I think to just have a look at it, I'm just going to clip it to the same area that we've clipped the 3 meter one. So I'm just going to quickly run through these. And I've clipped it and opened it. And then if we just look at them next to each other, you can see the difference in the detail, which is to be expected. You know, you can still see in the gaps we have deeper snow depths, but you're losing these fine scale distributions, and you're sort of losing exactly where the forest is compared to the open sites. You can also look at this in more detail, say if we look at the histograms. So I think the main thing here is if you look at the 3 meter histogram, you have quite a variability across the area. Whereas if you look at the 50 meter, you're losing those minimum and the maximum values. So they're getting averaged down to the middle. So, I mean, things to think about with the different data sets and what you might use them for, particularly if you want to use them to validate or compare to measured data compared to satellite information like ISAT2 and things like this is, you know, how are they representing the minimum, the maximum? How well does it represent the area? And things like this. And so I think there were snow-free areas in the 3 meter data set, but these get averaged out in the 50 meter data set. And so if you're using, you know, you're wanting to look at something like a snow disappearance date, does the 50 meter resolution really represent things like this? So the sort of final thing you can do with this data, so you can resample the data, and I did miss some of the tutorials yesterday, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating. But I just use a basic raster.io function to resample the data. So say we want to go from the 50 meter data up to a 250 meter resolution, we can just use an upscale factor, which is a ratio between your old resolution and your desired resolution. So if you just click on that, it'll just plot it straight away. And so you can see going from 250 to 250 meters, you get very, very little variability compared to the higher detailed maps. And you know, if you want to play around, you can load up the 3 meter one and change that to 3 and this sort of thing. So there's a bit to play around with. You can also obviously clip to different areas and larger model domains and load other data sets and you can play around with these as well. So this is just kind of a few things with the ASO data set from Grand Mesa. You know, there's also data from 2017. And they also have a lot of other locations as well. So I know there was a link to these yesterday in the NSIDC tutorial, but I just added them here. So these are just links to zip folders or zip files that will immediately download them to your computer. And Megan sent me a message on Monday. She said Grand Mesa has manual or so ground validation snow depth measurements. And then let me just double check what she said. And there might be some at East River, but unlikely will there be ground-based measurements for validation at Taylor River and Reynolds Creek. But you can also find other ASO data from other sites and things like SWE maps. So I only showed you snow depth, but ASO do a modeled SWE product as well. Or if you wanted to look at different snow density models, you could also look at how they perform in getting you SWE maps as well. So I think those are just some basics. I will just quickly look at the help to see if there are any questions. Okay, so everyone got this error with PYCRS. Yeah, thanks, Joe. I did do that on mine. I didn't know it wouldn't work on everyone else's, so maybe I should have added that in. And then does anyone want to just read, if anyone has questions, like just speak to them, because I'm having trouble reading and looking at you guys. So maybe if anyone has any questions, they could just shout them out. Okay, then Ben, I will just pass over to you. I can't work out. Just stop share.
There we go. Okay, thanks, Claire. Great tutorial. I'm going to try and share my screen. All right, there we go. And yell at me if my font sizes are no good or if you stop hearing me or anything. I'll say in advance that if I start coughing, you don't need to call an ambulance. I've been tested, it's not COVID. So let's see. Let me go to presentation mode. I'm sorry, I had this a minute ago. Presentation mode, there we go. We'll go to full screen. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to the ISAT2 tutorial. It's in the book /tutorials /LiDAR. And this is going to be covering really just kind of an add-on data set that's not really part of SnowEx exactly, but I think maybe is in the spirit of a lot of the things that SnowEx has been doing, and hopefully will help you take some of the ideas from SnowEx out to the rest of the world. So this is really a trial for something that might be compared to SnowEx data sets. And then hopefully this will help people do snow science in places that aren't as well covered by data as Grand Mesa is. So we're going to be talking about ISAT2. I'll give you a really brief overview of the satellite and maybe what it can do for you. And then I'll show a couple of examples of ways to access the data set using online resources. So there are ways that you can download data sets, but these will be focused on getting data onto your computer quickly so you can try it out, which I think is a good way to go if you're just dipping your toes in and you're curious about how this might work. So as everybody else has done, I'm going to import a bunch of libraries. I think most of these are needed for the tutorial. And I'm going to switch from the inline plots that are needed to get the notebook to render for the website. I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to go to Matplotlib in widget mode. And that gives us the zooming features that are always nice to have when you're doing figures. So just walking through this. ISAT2 is a satellite that NASA launched in 2018, and it's been collecting measurements that are good for measuring ice sheet changes and for measuring canopy height in non-polar regions. It uses a pulsed LiDAR that pulses 10,000 times a second. So it's making a measurement approximately every 70 centimeters. And these measurements are organized into 3 beam pairs that are spread out by 3 kilometers between the pairs. So you have a total width of the measurements of 6 kilometers, but it's only measuring 6 beam pairs within this. So you get 2 groups of beam pairs. They're spaced 90 meters apart so that you can measure the surface slope. That might not be particularly relevant to us, but when we're actually looking at the data, we'll see that some of the data are really strong. We get lots of data back, and some of them are kind of weak. We don't get a lot of data back. That's because in each pair, there's 1 strong beam and 1 weak beam. The strong beams can sometimes see through clouds that the weak beams can't. So this was just a more efficient way of allocating the energy we get back from the satellite. ISAT2 is flying a repeat orbit with almost 1,400 ground tracks. And it's repeating that orbit every 91 days. So in the polar regions, it would be making exact repeat measurements. Down by Grand Mesa, it's pointing off nadir to try and fill in the gaps in the vegetation model. So we'll get non-repeat measurements that show us something about the surface height and something about the canopy, but they're distributed spatially in a way that will typically not make the same measurement of the same spot. So to try and measure something like snow depth with ISAT2, we're going to need external data. And we'll get that from a LiDAR data set a dense LiDAR data set to which we can compare ISAT2 data. So the next slide, here's a picture of the organization of the beams. This is flying forwards. So ISAT2 sometimes flies forwards and sometimes flies backwards, those being sort of an arbitrary definition. When ISAT2 flies forwards, the strong beams are on the right. When ISAT2 flies backwards, the strong beams are on the left. This maybe doesn't have any strong application to us right now, except that we can't be guaranteed of always finding a strong beam on one side or another of the beam pairs. Okay, so let's take a look at the data that are available over Grand Mesa. Again, I'm going to be going through a couple of different ways of getting to the data. For a lot of the stuff that we're doing, we're going to want to have a base map. And I looked through tutorials that were available on the website and decided that Sentinel was the easiest way for me to get a base map. So we're going to be looking at LiDAR data on top of a SAR map, but that's should be just fine for understanding the geographic distribution of the data. Now, there are a lot of ways of searching for ISAT2 data, but one of the nice ones is IcePix, which was developed mostly by Jessica Sheik, and she's available on the Hackweek. She is probably dialed in now. And what we're going to use this for is querying the metadata that are stored on NSIDC for all of the ISAT tracks. So the first thing we're going to do is query the ATLO3 product, which gives photon level data. So it's going to tell us where actual photons were that were sent out from ISAT2 and bounced off the surface and came back to the satellite. So we've got a query for IcePix that gives a set of latitude and longitude limits, and then a date range. So this is just running from the early part of the mission until the middle of 2021. And we're giving it a random start and stop time saying, don't worry about the time of day, give us everything. To issue this kind of query yourself, you're going to, if you're not part of the Hackweek, you're going to have to input your own Earth data login information. This is taken care of because we're in the Hackweek. If you try and run this and it doesn't work for you, you can always uncomment this cell and put your email and your Earth data username in there, and it will prompt you in a couple of cells for your Earth data login. So when we run the available granules method on the IcePix query, it will give us, it will query the database and update itself with a list of available granules, and it'll tell us what it's found. So in this case, granule is one data file. And so there are 63 data files for a total, and the average size of these is 2,000 megabytes. So there's an awful lot of data here. And that's because these data files contain every photon that ISAT2 detected. The way we figure out what granules you might want to look at is by the producer granule ID for these things. So this is what one of these granule ID looks like. And I've got a function in the next cell to tell you how to parse that out into something semi-useful. So this is a regular expression. We're going to loop through all of the granules that we found. And this tells us the date and the reference track. So two files that are on the same reference track might be pointing to the same spot. Otherwise, we just have dates. So here are the first 10 dates we have, running from December of 2018 on off into the future. So from this point, it's quite possible to order data using IcePix, and IcePix will happily generate a request to the National Snow and Ice Data Center for the granules. But those granules are big, and they take a little while to run the subsetter at NSIDC. So we're going to switch to a different interface that will give us the data much more quickly, and that's the Open Altimetry interface. which gives us sort of real-time access to photon level data from ICET2. So,
can I have a quick question?
Yes, absolutely.
IcePix, can you use pick up the ALT08 product?
Yes, you can get ATL08 as well. You can get, I believe, all of the products up through ATL08. I think that would be the highest number that you could get. But those should all be available through IcePix. And there are some excellent tutorials that have been, I guess, looking at the IcePix page, there are some good example notebooks that will tell you how to navigate through to actually downloading the granules onto your own machine. And you have lots of options for how to subset them and select particular products you want to use. So this section is a little bit of an ad for IcePix rather than getting into the full functionality.
Thank you.
So the next thing is to use OpenAltimetry to try and get the data. OpenAltimetry, among other things, has a nice web interface that lets you just throw up on screen what the data might look like. But they also have an API that lets you form web queries that will ask for the data and then pull it back onto your own machine. And that's what we're going to be using today. So I put together a function that you can provide a date and a track number, which is what I just pulled out of the IcePix query, a set of latitude and longitude limits, and a section of beam names. So again, the beam names refer to the beam and the pair. So GT1L is the left beam in pair number 1, so it's the left beam in the left pair. GT3R is the right beam in the right pair. And by default, it asks for everything, but initially we're just going to use this to map the beams that are in the center of the beam array. And that'll just give us an idea of what's available, and it happens relatively quickly. So this function will, given relatively simple information, get us data from OpenAltimetry fairly quickly. So I'm going to run this cell to define the function, and then I'm going to run the function to get us all of the center beams for Grand Mesa. So I'll submit the query. This is the point where everybody's tutorial stops working. So my fingers are crossed. It should take 30 seconds or so. And if it doesn't, I'll really wish that I had rendered the notebook. Let's give it a couple more minutes. So I've been talking about getting, maybe I'll sort of mentally skip forward. I've been talking about getting the lowest level data, which is the timing for photons. This is run. As we go on, I'll show you also how to get actual height estimates, which I think are a more useful product, but the photons are useful to look at. So let's take a look at the results that we've gotten back. So I'm going to first visualize the Grand Mesa SAR image. So this black and white thing is the SAR image of Grand Mesa, and you can see the dark areas here are smooth, and that is the mesa itself. And then these tracks are color-coded just by date, basically. So it's just, these are all just different tracks that go over the Grand Mesa. And because we're using Matplotlib inline, we can zoom in on this. And we can see that most of the time these tracks don't repeat themselves, but there are a few of them where we have two tracks that are more or less on top of each other. And those are places where, at least initially, we might try and get repeat measurements. So the way I like to use zoom ins like this is if I want to find data, wow, okay, that was cool. If I want to try find data for a particular region, I zoom in and then I query the X range and the Y range for my plot. So that's what you would do in this cell. If you uncommented this and zoomed in and then executed this, it would load the X limits and the Y limits of your plot into a variable, and then we can use those to query the list of data that we have and find what data fall into those limits. But because I needed to render this for the website, I just put in a query, which is kind of in the middle of the west side of the plateau, and asked it for the tracks that intersect that. So it's going to tell us what tracks intersect that region. And so this tells us that we have one track from April of 2020, track 295, and another track from July of 2020, also track 295. So 295 got repeated in April and July. And so now let's get all of the data for that and plot them and see what it looks like. So again, we'll hit Open Altimetry. This time I'm not specifying just one beam, so it's going to get us all of the beams. And now hopefully we get a nice looking plot. But I'm going to plot the photon elevations as a function of the the north coordinate. So we're plotting along this line here. This is WGS84 height and the photon heights. So what I've done here, I've taken just all the photons and I've plotted those in black. So mostly this is just solar noise, and it's clipped to a window around the ground because the satellite can detect the ground and say anything that's close to the ground is going to get telemetered back. So we get a whole lot of these solar background photons. And then there's been a classification algorithm that's been run to specify the confidence with which we might suppose that a particular photon came from the ground. So if we zoom in on this over the plateau, we see that there's some stuff that definitely looks like the ground, and then some slightly more scattered photons that might be the ground, and then this morass of photons that are just noise. This is sort of the glory and the downfall of ICET2. It gives you a lot of data if you look at it at the photon level. It's very nice then to try and do something to these data to turn them into elevations rather than photons. The photons are hard to look at. Elevations are probably what we want. So from this point, we're going to move on to how to get elevations rather than just photons out of this. I'm listing 3 options here. These are not all the options. One of the options is to download higher level products. So ATL06 is the land ice processing, which is designed to look at ice sheets. It's maybe not what we want to look at over Grand Mesa because its resolution is a little bit coarse. We can look at ATL08, which applies land-specific algorithms and does a nice job of filtering out photons that came from trees. So either of these products will be helpful for telling us where the ground actually is. We could try and calculate the statistics of the photons ourselves. So we could look at a plot like this and say, yeah, I can see where the ground is. I can probably write a piece of code that will find those for me. It's not terribly hard. It's something that definitely a lot of us could do, but it's reinventing the wheel. And then there's a third service that has been under development with some of the people involved in the Hackweek, myself, David Sheen, Scott, have all worked on this. And this service is called Slide Rule, and it's a real-time processing service that lets you create custom products based on the ATL03 photon clouds. And just to give a little bit of an advert for this, I'm going to run this service right now and show you that we can get back surface heights using this in real time. So I've got a little bit of an overview of how to get Slide Rule. If you don't have it, you can uncomment this cell and run it, and it will just pull down the Python client from Slide Rule. Slide Rule has a local client that sends requests to a group of servers in the cloud that have access to the data and will do the processing for you. So it's a service. We have to make requests to the service to get the data processed for us. So here is what putting together a request looks like. We specify a region of interest, just like we did for open altimetry. We say what kind of classification we want applied to the photons. So I'm saying apply the land classification. We can say what photon confidence we want. So I'm saying medium confidence or better. I'm asking for 20-meter segments to be fit to the data. So we're going to fit 20-meter line segments. We're at a spatial resolution of 10 meters. I've got a typo here. That's actually 10 meters. And we're going to not look at any segments that don't have at least 2 photons separated by 5 meters. So we can put this request together and submit it to Slide Rule. It'll take just a little while to run, and it will complain at us because the query that we put together from CMR has tracks that lie outside our region. So just wait for the asterisk to disappear, and that will mean that we've got the data. So again, a little bit of suspense. I think that the developer of Slide Rule, JP Swinsky, is on the meeting right now. So he's probably watching his servers run fast as a lot of people put in queries. When we're done with this, I'm going to ask everybody to go back to this cell and we can all run it at once and we can see if we can break JP's servers. But we've gotten our results back and let's see what they look like. We're going to plot track 295 from cycle 7. So these are the April measurements. And we're going to do a colored scatter plot. So once again, here's Grand Mesa. And now we can see that we're color coded by surface height. We've got low heights when we're off the mesa. We've got high heights when we're on the mesa. I think we're doing well. This is just one of the tracks. We could plot any of the tracks. And most of them have pretty good looking elevations.
Sorry, Ben.
Yep.
Is this using what is essentially the ATL06 algorithm?
Yeah, it's a simplified version of the ATL06 algorithm. So it's not, doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it's doing the linear segment fit. And the great thing about Slide Rule is you can customize the resolution and you can customize the photon classification that goes into it. So we know that ATL06 doesn't work that well for Grand Mesa. Here's something with knobs on it that you can turn to try and make it work better. Okay. So let's see what that looks like when we plot the July and the April on the same axes. So now here's a transect across the plateau. We know that those two measurements are spatially pretty close to each other. If we look on the plateau, we see that we've got April in blue and July in orange, and April is lying on top of blue of July, and that is great. So it's an indication that we might be seeing snow depth differences between the two. To do this better, we can pull in a DEM. And the one that I'm going to use is a 3-dep 1-meter resolution DEM that's stored in an Amazon bucket. You can get to this, you can see what's available using the 3-dep LiDAR Explorer. I've got the URL right here. If we go to this, it gives us a web interface where you can draw a box and see who might have provided LiDAR data. And it's available in some cases as point clouds. More consistently, it's available as DEMs, and you can download it off the web. It's a great service. So for this, we're going to use Rio X-Array, or I don't know how to pronounce that. We're going to call it RXR, and we're going to download the DEM and convert it into the same CRS as we're using for Grand Mesa. I don't have the vertical datum right on this, so we're going to see that it's not quite at the right height, but it sure looks like it's in the right place horizontally. And we're going to downsample this to 3 meters just for the sake of speed. So let's take a look at that. Looks like a DEM. This is just one tile of the of a bigger collection of 1 meter DEMs. We're going to make an interpolator for this that lets us interpolate the DEM down to the ISAT2 locations. And we're going to sample that DEM at the ISAT2 points. So now let's take a look at what that looks like. So again, now we've got the track 295 coming across just the very side of the DEM. Here we've got the April measurements and the DTM. The DTM is above the April measurements. That's not good. It means that we've got some sort of datum problem here. But maybe we can get around that by using the repeat measurements we have. So differencing both the July and the April against the same DEM and comparing them against one another. So now let's take the difference between April and the DTM and July and the DTM and plot those as a function of distance. And what we get is this. We get the July measurements are low, the April measurements are high, and there might be some bumpiness in the July measurements that gets covered over by the snow in April. So this looks like it might actually be something like a map of snow depth. And then we've got the average offset of the DTM here, which we could subtract out by assuming that the July ISAT measurements are just measuring the surface height. So this is my first crack at getting snow depth for Grand Mesa with ISAT2. There are lots of things that could be done to move this down the road, and I think that this is the sort of thing that the Space Lasers project is going to work on. And that's the end of my tutorial. I've got just a couple more links at the bottom. So I'm happy to take a minute to take questions.
I have a question. So you said Grand Mesa, there's no repeat. So how do you know July and April, you're looking at the same spot?
Yes, okay. So that is way back sorry, my scrolling is going slowly. Sorry, this plot, let me see if I can regenerate this plot because something seems to have gone wrong there. There we go. So if we zoom in on this plot, this happens to be the tracks that I was looking at. So right there, you see two tracks that basically lie right on top of each other. And so that's 100 meters there. They're separated by not very much. The reason that these tracks are all, they should be measured all at exactly the same line, but we're seeing vertical scatter in the photons mapping into horizontal scatter here. So that's what tells us that these two measurements are at any rate very close to each other. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm just wondering, yeah, they are overlay, but you can still see there some difference, particularly when you measure the snow depth, such a smaller number. The tiny difference, horizontal difference could
Yeah.
maybe.
That's the idea behind differencing both of these against the DEM. So
Okay.
if you subtract both of the measurements differenced against the DEM and subtract those from each other, the height of the DEM can cancel out.
I see.
So
thank you.
Get away with an offset that way.
Thank you.
I have a more technical or laser specific question. I remember from the first ISAT2 Hackweek we did that Tom mentioned something about ISAT2 first launching in what I remember as low power versus high power mode. So the high power being over the polar regions and then a more kind of reduced operational mode over the regions like Grand Mesa. Has this changed since, or is that still kind of a case where we should keep something in mind about the ISAT2 measurements there?
So just a second. ISAT2 has, I know what you're talking about. when ISAT-2 first launched, the lasers were turned up 1 notch. So the lasers were operating in a slightly higher power mode than they are now. That was too bright on the poles, so the detectors were saturating, and it was compromising the accuracy of the measurements. So they turned it down by about 20%. So it's not a huge difference for what you get someplace like Grand Mesa. A lot of the time you see much bigger differences just based on how cloudy it is.